Kelly, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
You're back. You're here.
We're back.
And we're back. I have those things. Hang on. There we go. I got you got all those little dingers. I don't use them as much as I used
to. You're so legit. I think the quote was, "You're so money. Do you even know how money you are?"
Now, that was the movie that I watched when it came out, and it was The Quote Machine, right? Talking about swingers.
Yeah.
And it was a quote machine.
Yeah.
And I remember several years later, I was at a bar with a woman, and we made a date. And I was like, because I quoted it so many times, but she was a little younger, and she's like, I don't know what you're saying. And I'm like, you've never seen Swingers.
There is a song. One of my favorite bands is Steely Dan.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. It's my mom. It's like this thing. But I grew up listening to a lot of Steely Dan, and there's a song in there called Hey 19.
Okay.
And I was always like, what's this song about? And he's like, Hey 19, that's Aretha Franklin. Hey 19, we can't dance. And he's talking about talking to a 19-year-old and being like, you're a space alien.
Right.
And suddenly you just had that, but you're like, that movie came out 2 years ago.
So then we get together to watch it, though. And here's the double twist, is we're 20 minutes in, and I'm like, oh, this isn't hitting for me. She's looking at me like, I don't get it. And I'm even going, I remember this differently. I remembered Swingers as I'm like, there wasn't a better movie.
Well, the real question now is, by extension, what else isn't aging well? Like,
right.
The way I felt about PT school, my relationships, how I viewed myself as an athlete. Like, you start to reconsider a lot there.
You start to think, how accurate is my memory? How accurate is my view on the world? Like, oh my gosh, now you start to question everything.
Perfect.
I'm like, Swingers isn't the thing that I remember it as?
In COVID, I have 2 teenage daughters, and I was like, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get caught up. There's a whole bunch of movies you need to see for reference. And some of them are going to be great, some are bad. But if you don't understand the Matrix and taking the blue pill, red pill, I'm like, that's the problem. Yeah. We watched Risky Business.
Okay.
Everyone, that's a movie. Tom Cruise. And A, it's awful. And B, it's about like, well, he gets in trouble because he brings these prostitutes in and he gets double swindled, all because he's lied to his parents about stealing the car. My daughter was like, you mean that whole dance scene is the one thing? And I was like, now you know.
Yeah, out of context.
Dun, 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 dun. So anyway.
Yeah, some of those things hold up, some of those things don't.
Yeah.
I don't know if I told you this the first time we talked, but I was going through the transition from radio broadcaster, and I was a bartender at a bar in South Carolina while I was doing my prereqs, and I was like, I don't know, I'm going to this. And a buddy of mine who's not in physical therapy, who is sort of in our group of friends, always the guy who was always just looking and lurking and going, how do I move better? How do I make myself feel better? He was always an athlete, but it was always never necessarily a passion, but always just something he always did. And he found out I was going to PT school, and he mailed me Supple Leopard. He's like, I don't really know what this guy does.
Did it come on a pallet, like freight?
I don't know.
The sign for it was so heavy.
It was decent. But it did. It felt like a text. So I'm trying to remember exactly how he framed it. He goes, sort of a textbook for your body.
You know what's bananas is that book has wound up in a lot of places, and it's created a lot of paradigm shift in people realizing that there's a lot they can do to make themselves feel better, move better, and that some of this doesn't belong in physical therapy.
Right.
So, thank goodness for Mulligan, thank goodness for my Maitland background, but I was like, hey, do I always have to have someone mobilize my own hips? And if you go to the hip capsule mode, flip someone over, that's hip quadrant. That's like classic Maitland stuff. So I literally was thinking like, hey, I got to get the PT out of the room. And what's crazy about that book is it just went over 1 million copies.
Wow.
I know.
Could you have wrapped your head around that when you were writing? Well, first of all, let's go back. Why did you decide to write it?
That's a great question. That's a terrible use of your time to write a book.
But like, why? Like you said, I haven't not. Like, why? Like, what did success look like before you put pen to paper?
I think, I was running a gym. I was a physio, and at the time there was this real nascent idea of how do we expand. For me, it was like, how do I expand physical therapy into not just playing, catch, rebound, late.
8 minutes.
Or I've already saw you when, man, that hip is a hot mess and you don't have any internal rotation, you don't have any hip flexion. And who owns that problem? And why didn't that get sorted out in the gym? Because remember, I owned a gym for 17 years. Yeah. So I saw a big population. We ran a very good gym, my wife and I, for a lot of time. General pop, kids. We had an adaptive athletics program with UCSF. We had world champions in there. We had a high-level Chinese Olympic lifting team. We could see it all. And early on in this process, I'm like, hey, I actually don't need any of these quick tests. I've got it. It's called, can you air squat? Right. And then can you squat when your heart rate's high? Can you show me that you can have this fundamental pattern under load, under speed, under cardiorespiratory demand, metabolic demand? What happens if we change the implement? What happens if it's a novel task? What happens if we add speed and go fast? And so suddenly I was like, it makes everything visible. So ultimately, when, like, you know, Gray Cook is a good friend of mine, and people love to bash the FMS as sort of an easy trope. I'm like, oh, it's called the FMS effect. Oh, you need to get some attention? Go ahead and talk about came out in 1996. And I'm like, how did you understand how people were moving in 1996? You didn't have any tools. They were doing cable crossover. No one was overhead squatting in 1996. Fast forward you know, with CrossFit and functional fitness, suddenly we're asking people to express normative ranges of motion under these conditions, and it made the invisible visible. Yeah. And suddenly, you know, instead of saying, here's your test today about how you move, because that's a moving, living document, you know, jump on an airplane.
Today.
Yeah, right. This is who you are today. If I'm really going to understand you, I need to see you under these different conditions and how you handle these different conditions. And then I can really understand what inputs and outputs are and where your minimums are and where you compensate, or if you don't like the word compensation because that's a triggering word, we'll say, what are your strategies that are less effective, right?
That's
and what we're able to do is get away from pain, no pain, because that was a really specious argument.
Right.
I work with all of these world champions, all these superstars. I'll take a world champion I work with named Kate Courtney. She is an Olympian. She's a world champion. She is a mountain biker. She's one of the greatest, most complete athletes I know. If I dropped into her brain in the middle of a World Cup, I would perish from pain. So suddenly, this conversation of pain, no pain, I was like, this is a common athletic experience. Why is that the only thing we're chasing in physical therapy?
It's not binary.
Got you out of pain, you're functional enough, your shoulder doesn't hurt, you can do your brow, go out of here. And I was like, hold on, that has nothing to do with this over here. So what are the things I'm left with? Range of motion and the expression of range of motion, which is really biomotor output, wattage, poundage. Oh, we're back to performance again.
Right.
So when we started using those lenses about saying, hey, you can't put your arm over your head, you don't have any rotation, like why can't you express, why did I memorize Norkin and White as a physical therapy student if I'm not going to use it,
right,
but I'm never going to see it as a coach? And that was really where we started to recognize that we had a movement theory, and really the IP of Supple Leopard is that it's a model to understand complex human behavior in the language of strength and conditioning.
Right.
It doesn't try to purport to tell you all the things the spine can do. It just says, hey, here's how we can understand this complex movement system. And then this book is really the prequel.
So walk me through that. Like, this is just out. You're doing the book signing here, Built to Move. Like, this is the prequel. What do you mean?
Well, what we found was, in the pandemic, a couple things. One is that we look around and say, look, we're going to go way back here. Hold on, everybody. Dune is my favorite book of all time.
It's coming back around.
I know. And if you've ever seen Dune or read it, everyone, Paul gets tested to see if he's a human being. He puts his hand in the box. And what's in the box? Pain. And in the book, you'll realize he pulls his hands out, and she's like, our test is crisis and observation. And Paul goes, I see the truth of it. So we really don't know how robust a system is. We don't know how stable a system is. We don't know how ready a person is until we put them under some strain. So the real question is, a pandemic rolls around, how did we do? Could we feed ourselves? Nope. We gained 15 pounds on average. We saw that people defaulted back to self-soothing strategies that were less effective, a lot more drinking, a lot more
Netflix
drugs.
and chill.
Oh, yeah. And so what we saw was that we didn't really come out of the pandemic. And the research now, I just saw UCL injuries are through the roof. ACL injuries are still through the roof.
Wow.
Surgeries, obesity, diabetes, substance abuse, social isolation. Choose something you give a rat's ass about and ask yourself, is it better?
Is it better than it was 4 years ago?
And what I'll say is that the industrial fitness complex, which makes $1 trillion industry, I'm not talking about physio here. I think I was just on a panel with Dr. Megan Brown, and she pointed out we are moving into the fitness industry. They're not moving into the physio industry, right? And what we need to understand is, man, if this $1 trillion industry isn't doing what it purports to do, which is make us healthier, it's not
Right.
working. Then we need to ask different questions. Gray Cook had a conversation with Shirley Sarmon a million years ago, and this is secondhand. This is firsthand through Gray, where they're talking about the need for people to go see a physical therapist for a yearly checkup. Wouldn't that be great, like the dentist?
Sure.
And Shirley was like, well, what would you even check? What would every physical therapist, what would you agree on? So what we tried to do in here is say, we work in a lot of high-performance environments, like a lot. We see a lot of dirty laundry from This year I have 7 Olympic sports I'm supporting, a bunch of universities, pro teams across, from the English national soccer team to the All Blacks to the Niners. We just see a lot of dirty laundry. And what we're trying to do is say, and this is an E.O. Wilson quote, evolution psychologist. He says, look, the highest calling of science is to serve the humanities. And I think the highest calling of sport is to transform our community. And not just in like, hey, we both agree on this is the good team, but we can actually take the lessons from high performance and say, how can we transform our households?
Right.
How can we transform our daily behaviors? Because we see under stress what works and what doesn't work. So one of my favorite coaches is this guy named Frans Bosch, this Dutch coach, and he says there's more variation in waltzing than there is in sprinting, which means at low load, low speed, low consequence, you can probably walk with your feet out and
right.
round your back and duck and eat little chocolate donuts and smoke a cigarette. And it just doesn't matter because you're a human being, right? And you may never have pain. So that's why that conversation doesn't work. But at high speeds, high loads, high stress, high consequence, we start to see these things really do start to matter. And we really start to see emergent of what unified field theory looks like, because the human being is not that special and unique. No matter what everyone tells you about your unique squat stance, right? Your hip is your hip, and runners run in a certain way. And so Juliet and I felt like, well, how can we take those lessons and transmute them into some vital science? Evidence-based, we've got the research, we've seen the practice. Can we create 10 options for people? And through the physio lens, everyone, there is no way you're interacting with someone in managed care with reimbursement and talking about their sleep and tracking it and really getting into nutrition. You just don't have time. It's impossible. You're making a problem list and you're just trying to knock off 1 or 2 things. What we wanted to say, hey, look, we want you to get off those blood pressure meds. Let's begin a wholesale conversation around some vital signs around sleep and movement and KPIs. Balance, right? And then let's also create some movement vital signs, some benchmarks. Again, not 1 or 0, which is what I live in, right? Like, hey, your shoulder's either complete or it's not. But red, yellow, green, just like 120/80 is not rock star blood pressure, but it allows us to say, hey, we should pay attention. So now we have some movement vital signs. And I'll tell you, subversively, one of the things we're trying to do is I want physio to own lifestyle medicine. The physicians are like, oh, this longevity lifestyle medicine thing is really good. It's really lucrative. Yeah, you're right. I was just at Stanford last week talking to them about the med school, working with them, presenting. And I'm like, you know who's best at lifestyle medicine? Yeah. Right here. But we're going to have to think differently about where and when we're delivering that. So that's what this book is about.
That's great. You just hosted a panel with Megan Brown, as you mentioned. Yep. Danielle from NASA. Yep. I guess she's got some good telehealth skills when her people she's working with are not on planet.
Yeah, she's amazing.
And then Frank as well. The theme there was what? Like breaking out, mold breaking? And
the theme was, I think it's difficult to wrap our heads around the entirety of what physical therapy is, right? We all have this kind of classic education physical therapy. It varies a little bit, right? Basics. And I think what we've done is set up these institutions and it's not malevolent. I'm not bashing anything. We have a sports section, we have an orthopedic section, a pediatric section, right? We have these different sections, but they don't necessarily encompass what's possible with the field. And I'm not to say that we don't need those things. These institutions and institutionalism exists. But there's a whole side of what people are doing with this classic education, which is a little bit different. Dr. Megan Brown runs, as a physio-owned practice where she teaches Pilates and yoga-based movement.
It's a Trojan horse. Come on in and have some Pilates. And, oh, by the way, I happen to be a physio. It's very simple, not easy. It's just another way around.
So whatever your language is, if that's CrossFit,
right.
And now we can actually talk to you about your life before you're on fire.
Right.
Because, if you come to see me as a physio and you're on fire, first thing I got to do is put the fire out. Then I got to back the tractor trailer back down the...
Calm you down.
Right, back down the blind alley. Then I got to turn that around. Then we got to It's a lot easier to have conversations early on and to jump on things earlier on, especially since movement is the thing. And until we start to really rectify, you're not moving to the fullest expression or don't even have access to that, then let's accept what it is. It's a great moneymaker.
Yeah.
People are going to mess themselves up. They don't know why their shoulders hurt, but they can't put their arms over their head. Look, everyone here is going to go to an airport. Go through the airport scanner. Yeah. We call it the airport scanner test in here.
Oh, yeah.
And you're going to see the horror show. Yep. And you're like, why are you doing that with your back? Because that's the only way you can get your arms above your head. Yeah. Did you see Andor in Star Wars?
Yeah.
Do you see when they're like on station, they got to put their hands behind their head?
Yes.
Do you see how few people could actually put their hands behind their head?
Yeah, I guess I didn't notice.
You'll go back and you'll be like, the guys are like, their hand behind their head, and you can see the actors are like, struggling to put their hands behind their neck. And I'm like, isn't that interesting? So everything is everything. If we can begin a conversation about expanding and not expanding our practice scope, we already do this. It's owning our scope of practice. And that's what we're trying to do is I want to show, especially this next generation of kids, hey, you really can be creative about problem-solving areas that you're interested in. We have the lead performance of NASA, right? So
Danielle Anderson.
Danielle Anderson running, that performance lead is run by a physical therapist. We have a PT incubator, Frank Benedetto, who is helping physios start their own dream practices. We have Megan working in literally public health.
Past the proof of concept, she's doing it.
So we have these 3 different divisions of, hey, here's where we also can go. Where do those things fit?
Yeah.
And I think APTA, for no fault of its own, is an institution, suffers from institutionalism, just like AMA does, like
Sure.
The APA. And so what we want to do is figure out how can we wrap our arms around these clinicians, these providers, these entrepreneurs, and say, hey, there's actually a place here, and you've actually benefited from the advocacy of the APTA for years. So don't pretend like you don't benefit from this.
Right. They don't do anything for me.
They don't do anything.
Yeah,
that's horse shit.
Yeah. So the panel was great. You talked about Danielle and Frank and Megan. Did you know Megan taught me in PT school? She was in my exercise phys curriculum. So it was kind of like, and it was great because
legend.
There were 40 kids in my staff, in my class. I call them kids because I was like the oldest by like 10 years. And 10 of us were dudes, and we went to Megan's for Pilates.
Oh.
And
how'd that go?
I'm not saying who they were, David, my roommate, but he was a baseball player in college. And he's like, how hard could this be? And David's an in-shape dude, very in shape. This is a different thing. Megan put you in positions to challenge you very simply. No weight. There were minimal weights in Megan's class. Let me
ask you, why was it so hard? Because you didn't have access. Didn't even have access to that range.
Correct.
And it's not crazy. Pilates is not crazy. It's not even like, you're not even like Simone Biles when you go through Pilates class.
Right.
It's just long lever. You can't hide.
Right. That was the thing.
It's long lever control. And so one is you didn't have access to that. And 2, you had crap motor control.
No experience.
And sorry, did I just trigger you again? Movement control. Right. So the idea here is what I think I want everyone who's listening to this to do is, if you think your exercise program as a personal physical therapist, because you're is legit, go jump into a CrossFit class. You're not going to win, but you should be able to do all those things.
Right.
Go to a Pilates class. You should be able to do all those things. Did you jump into a yoga class? Did you get your butt kicked? Then you should probably do those things. And that's really what we're ultimately trying to say is, how do we create exposure in the population to all the positions and shapes that we should be touching?
Yeah.
Right. So we have this thing we teach. Every one of our teams, every one of our athletes gets the shoulder spin up, the hip spin up, or a breath practice every day. Your choice. You can do one of those 3 things. The first 10 minutes in the morning, we do that with all our teams, all our operators, everyone who's out in the world. We see that you have 10 minutes in the morning to improve something. And a hip spin up looks a lot like sun salutation. Super weird. It's almost like this 10 or 15 minute yoga flow. I was like, that's a good idea. We should make that for athletes.
So that panel that you just moderated, that, like, there was a consistent theme, which is like people in places doing things that weren't necessarily expected or in ways that aren't normal.
So
right?
it should be surprising and novel and like, wow, we didn't know that was part of the thing.
But they're all proof of concept.
Yeah.
I see a common theme. People come to me because I talk to people on a microphone a lot, and they'll ask me questions. They're looking for permission. They're looking for me or someone or everyone or they to say it's okay for them to do the thing that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
You did that.
I did.
That was you. That's why you're hosting that. Because you did it.
I got crushed by PT, crushed me. They didn't like it. Really threatened by it.
Because you said this is a manual. Take. You don't need the PT to do all these things. And you weren't saying, and I don't want to put words in it, you weren't saying PT didn't have value. You were saying this can be done in other places by you.
We can go a step further and say, and this is controversial, a couple things here. One is, what is skilled care at a doctor level? Is it you teaching me dead bugs? No, bro, no. At my gym, I had 5 physios on staff, plus me. We had a whole bunch of world-class coaches. People came from all over the world to train with us. National champions in gymnastics, et cetera, et cetera. You would be hard-pressed to figure out who was a physio and who was a coach until the physio went over to the table, right? And really the question is who owns the problem. The person owns the problem and needs to be
Right.
aware of that training is also means you're looking at your range of motion.
Right.
So ultimately, what we want to do is I want to unload all of the unskilled care to the coach, to the personal trainer, which means they need to be able to, like if you go into the ACSM or those people, they're like, pain is a medical problem. I'm like, oh, really? Let me ask these 100 teenagers I've got, who's pain-free? Not a hand goes up. I'm like, oh, it's all a medical problem. Coaches can't talk to them. I'm like, who's seen a physical therapist? Not a hand goes up, right? Because it's not, we divide everything into incident or injury. And an incident is pain, an incident is loss of range of motion, right? These are the things that happen when you overdo it, right? It doesn't mean you're injured. You just got to back off, or your brain is asking for a request for change, right? Yeah, pain. But what we realize is that there's a whole lot of things we can move to the side, and what we've seen is in strength and conditioning or fitness, they have owned and just co-opted all of the like low-level exercise that we used to give out as, first-level physical therapy. They gave me my exercises. Like, that's all on the internet now, and it's all been co-opted. And I say, thank God. I don't want to teach clamshells and bridges.
Right.
That should be low-level stuff. That's done. Let me get to the real thing. Let me get to the nuance of your lifestyle. Let me get to the nuance
Stuff
of.
I gotta use this with.
Yes, and that's a doctoring field. So maybe we can also look at, if I'm a doctor, maybe I spend my time working at the high-level stuff, and my patients are actually being managed by a health coach or managed by a strength coach who can do those things really well, and then set them up to be independent, know how to self-soothe at home, work on intercession change, and then I'm doing the cool rad stuff. I may be the best person to teach you front squatting, but I don't have to be the person to teach you front squatting.
Right. So what would you say to someone, let's say you came back next year to CSM in Texas, be a little warmer than Boston in February, and you were hosting a similar panel, right? But someone's going to be on that panel 10 years from now. They're sitting there listening going, I have the thing, I want to do the thing that is going to ruffle feathers, but they're locked in that permission.
Doesn't have to ruffle feathers. They need to solve a problem in their community. I think one of the things... That's
innovation.
It is innovation, or iteration. So it's hard to innovate now, but it's really easy to iterate.
So explain the difference.
Innovate might be like you're doing something new.
Paradigm jumping.
Right. And iteration is that I can twist and make to serve my need.